What happens when the president of a country writes a letter admitting he no longer runs his own government? That letter exists right now, and the man who wrote it is still technically in office. Before we go further, if you want to understand what's really happening behind the headlines, hit subscribe now. Tap the like button and share this with someone who only sees the surface story. A sitting president has told the most powerful man in his country, in writing, that he can no longer do his job, not in a leaked recording, not in a rumor passed between exiles, in an actual letter sent to the office of the supreme leader. The message inside it was simple and devastating. The government has been pushed out of its own decision-making, and a hardline military faction now controls what used to be civilian business. When the person sitting in the president's chair admits on paper that he is no longer really the president, that's not a political disagreement. That's a confession that the system itself has already changed shape, whether anyone announced it or not. So let's slow down, because this story is bigger than one letter. It's about what happens when a country built on a careful balance of power finally tips all the way to one side, and what that means for the 88 million people who have no say in any of it. To understand why this matters, you need to understand how Iran has worked for almost 50 years. Not the version printed in textbooks, the version that actually decides who eats, who travels, and who disappears. Iran has never really been run by one government. It has always been two. The first is the one that shows up at the United Nations, signs statements, gives interviews, and talks about diplomacy. Presidents come and go through that door. The second government doesn't bother with interviews. It wears a uniform, controls a vast share of the economy, runs its own intelligence networks, and answers to almost no one outside its own chain of command. For decades, that second government, the Revolutionary Guard, has been the actual center of gravity, no matter whose name was on the president's office door. What kept that arrangement from collapsing into open conflict was a referee sitting above both sides, not elected, not accountable to ordinary citizens, but powerful enough that both the civilian government and the military leadership treated his word as final. That referee is 86 years old, and for the first time in his decades in power, there is open, public discussion inside Iran about what happens after him, and who from his inner circle might already be exercising that authority on his behalf. That's the backdrop the president's resignation letter landed on. According to reporting from Iran International, the letter didn't request permission to step down from the supreme leader's office in the abstract. It was addressed and reportedly may need to be accepted by a name that wasn't supposed to matter yet, the supreme leader's own son. Whether or not that succession question is formally settled, the fact that a sitting president's resignation is being routed through that name tells you something the regime would rather you not notice. Power has already started moving. Nobody simply announced it. Now let's talk about what's actually happening to people standing in line for bread, because the numbers on a screen don't capture what this feels like in a kitchen. The Iranian rial has done something almost no currency in modern history has done. It has gone from roughly 30,000 to the dollar at the time of the old nuclear deal to over $1 million to the dollar within the space of a few years, and by some recent readings past 1.7 million to the dollar. Try to sit with that for a second. Money you saved a year ago is worth a fraction of what it was. A salary that covered rent and groceries now barely covers groceries. Inflation has been running past 60% year over year, and in some recent weeks, certain everyday goods jumped in price by as much as 100% in a single week. Picture what that actually means inside a home. A bakery in Tehran or Karaj that used to hand out bread freely now rations how many loaves a single customer can buy, because the subsidized flour that keeps prices low simply isn't arriving in the quantities it used to. A father doing the mental math of whether there's enough left over this week for both bread and medicine, and realizing there isn't. A government estimate, even by the state's own admission, put a staggering share of the population, more than half by some counts, into some level of malnourishment. This isn't a future risk anyone is warning about. It's already on the table, or rather it's already not on the table. And the system meant to keep this from spiraling. The head of Iran's own central bank already resigned once before, as the rial cratered and crowds gathered in the streets of Tehran's Grand Bazaar. The Grand Bazaar matters here in a way that should make any government nervous. Merchants in that exact district played a defining role in the protests that toppled the monarchy back in 1979. When the people who keep the literal cash registers of the country running start walking out into the street, that is not a symbolic gesture. That is the same group of people who have, once before, in this country's history, helped end a government. Now think about the people whose actual job is to keep all of this under control. The police standing at checkpoints, the intelligence officers monitoring phones, the prison guards on overnight shifts. These are human beings living through the exact same currency collapse, the exact same bread lines, the exact same fear of what next month's prices will look like. History is remarkably consistent about what happens inside regimes like this when the people enforcing the rules start to feel just as poor as the people they're suppressing. Loyalty in systems built this way was never really about belief in an ideology. It was about benefits, a better apartment, steady pay, some small protection from the chaos everyone else was living through. When that gap closes, when the enforcer is standing in the same breadline as the protester, the loyalty that gap used to buy doesn't always disappear all at once. But it stops being something you can count on. So how has the military responded to all this pressure? Not with quiet confidence. With moves that look strong from a distance and desperate up close. Reports describe a senior Iranian delegation traveling to Doha in recent weeks, demanding the immediate, unconditional release of $12 billion in frozen cash as part of negotiations with the United States. Qatari officials reportedly refused to hand over the full amount, agreeing to release only half, and even then, not directly in cash. A country that once postured as untouchable is now negotiating in person for a fraction of its own frozen money, and not even getting all of that. This is the trap built over decades, and it doesn't have a clean exit. The Revolutionary Guard's entire justification for its budget and its grip on the economy depends on having an enemy to confront, but every escalation against that enemy makes the underlying economy, the one actually paying everyone's salaries, weaker. They can't back down because backing down means admitting they didn't need all that power and money in the first place. They can't keep escalating either, because escalation is what helped trigger the sanctions and the naval restrictions strangling oil exports right now. There is no move left on the board that doesn't cost them something enormous. Now let's step into the streets, because something has shifted there that genuinely hasn't happened quite like this before. Protests that began in the final days of December spread within weeks to all 31 of Iran's provinces. Not one city, not one region, every province. What started as anger over the economy widened, in many places, into open chants calling for the death of the dictator and the end of the Islamic Republic itself. For over 45 years, the regime's standard explanation for every hardship has been the same. This isn't our fault. It's foreign sanctions, foreign plots, foreign enemies trying to weaken us. For a long time, fear kept people from saying out loud what they actually believed. That fear is visibly thinner now. Estimates of the death toll from the crackdown that followed range enormously, from a few thousand by the government's own count to tens of thousands by opposition estimates, a gap so wide it tells its own story about how little anyone trusts the official version anymore. We're at the halfway point here, and what comes next ties all of it together. If you're finding this useful, drop a comment with one word describing how this story makes you feel. It genuinely helps this reach more people who need to see the full picture. Let's talk about the referee now, because this is the piece that makes everything else more dangerous. At 86, with no clear, publicly confirmed successor, the question of who actually has the final word inside Iran's power structure is no longer a hypothetical academic exercise. It is, by multiple independent accounts, an active and urgent debate happening right now among analysts, exiled opposition groups, and reportedly inside the regime's own circles. The president's own resignation letter, by alleging that hardline IRGC factions have already filled the vacuum in day-to-day decision-making, is itself a kind of public test of that question. If the answer to who runs the country has already quietly changed, even before any formal announcement, then everyone outside that inner circle, citizens, foreign governments, even other officials, is reacting to decisions made by people whose authority was never actually confirmed to the public. When power shifts that way, quietly, without a vote or a formal handover, the people making decisions tend to optimize for a different goal than long-term stability. They optimize for surviving the next few weeks, not because they are suddenly incompetent, but because the ground under them is moving in real time, and the safest move always looks like the one that protects your own position today. That is exactly the kind of environment where serious miscalculation becomes far more likely, not because anyone wants conflict, but because nobody at the top is confident enough in tomorrow to plan past it. Now let's bring this back to the people actually living through it, because their experience is the real center of this story. Imagine working a government job, the kind that used to guarantee stability, and still not being able to afford meat, which has become something close to a luxury item for a growing share of the population. Imagine a mother whose family is already fractured by the regime's prisons, learning her husband suffered a stroke and is in a coma while she herself remains detained, unable to be at his side. These aren't hypothetical hardships invented for a script. They are individual stories already being reported, multiplied across millions of households living under the exact same economic and political pressure at the exact same time. The protests spreading across Iranian provinces right now aren't being run by some hidden organized opposition pulling strings from outside the country, even though plenty of exiled groups would like to take credit. They're being driven by something simpler: hunger, debt, and exhaustion. A bakery limiting how many loaves a family can buy doesn't need anyone to explain that something fundamental is broken. The empty shelf says it for them. And remember those enforcers we talked about, the ones whose loyalty used to be guaranteed by a comfortable gap between their lives and everyone else's. They're the ones being sent to face down crowds filled with people experiencing the exact same inflation, the exact same shortages, the exact same fear about next month. That gap that used to hold the system together is being worn thin from both directions at once. Now let's zoom out, because what's happening inside Iran's borders doesn't stay inside Iran's borders. A narrow channel off Iran's southern coast, the Strait of Hormuz, carries roughly a fifth of the entire world's daily oil supply. Every government watching this situation isn't doing so out of curiosity about Iranian domestic politics. They're watching because instability there can move fuel prices everywhere else within days. The regime has understood this leverage for decades, and the constant low hum of threats against shipping in that strait isn't really a display of strength. It's the one card a cornered player still has left, even knowing that playing it would hurt almost everyone, including themselves, since Iran's own oil exports depend on those same waters staying open. At the same time, the United States has expanded a naval presence restricting Iranian oil exports, and reimposed United Nations sanctions came back into force last year through a mechanism triggered by European powers, freezing assets abroad and choking off arms transactions. The same fear that makes outside governments cautious about a sudden Iranian collapse also makes them deeply reluctant to do anything that looks like propping up a government willing to threaten global energy supplies the moment it feels cornered. That kind of leverage, used too often, eventually stops working as leverage and starts working as the reason nobody wants to help you. Here's the simple math underneath all of it. You cannot run a country of 88 million people if you can't reliably pay the people enforcing your rules. It isn't about ideology at this stage. It's arithmetic. Oil revenue has been squeezed by sanctions and a naval blockade. The shadow networks that used to quietly move sanctioned oil and money around the restrictions, the kind of arrangement that connected Iran to Venezuela's own sanctioned exports, have themselves come under direct pressure, including the seizure of vessels accused of carrying that exact cargo. Every workaround this regime built over 20 years to survive outside the international financial system is now, one by one, being closed off. The president's resignation letter might end up being remembered as one early signal among several, not a single isolated event. The central bank governor walked away once before. Other officials may follow, either quietly stepping back the way some already have, or digging in and betting on the side that currently holds the guns. Whether more names follow won't be a matter of bravery or sudden ideological awakening. It will be people doing the same calculation everyone in that position eventually does, protecting themselves first when the institution they served can no longer offer anything in return for staying loyal to it. There's an old saying about rats leaving a sinking ship. It was never about understanding naval engineering. It's about sensing something underfoot before anyone else is willing to say it out loud. Before we get to the ending, here's one more thing. If this video helped you understand the situation more clearly than a headline could, the most useful thing you can do is share it with someone who's only seen the surface-level version of this story. Here's what's worth understanding about what comes next. Systems under this kind of pressure don't necessarily become calmer as they weaken. Often they become more volatile for a while because the people in charge are no longer thinking in years, they're thinking in weeks. And the tools they reach for under that pressure tend to be the same ones they've always reached for. Control, force, restricted internet access, mass arrests, harsher sentencing. None of that addresses a currency in free fall or bakeries rationing flour. It just buys time, and time bought that way tends to be expensive. The people of Iran didn't create this particular convergence of sanctions, mismanagement, war, and currency collapse. They've simply been the ones standing in the lines it produced. They have a documented, multi-generational history of pushing back against exactly this kind of pressure. In 1979, in 2009, in 2019, in 2022, and now again. What's different this time isn't the existence of unrest. Iran has weathered waves of protest before, and the security apparatus has, so far, stayed loyal enough to hold the line each time. What's different is the simultaneous stacking of pressures, a currency that has lost almost all its value in a few short years, a war that left the military and its proxies visibly weaker than they've been in decades, a frozen, shrinking pool of foreign cash even allies are reluctant to release in full, and now a sitting president publicly admitting, in writing, that the government he leads has already been sidelined. So here's the real question, the one that actually matters going forward. It isn't whether this exact configuration of power can survive indefinitely in its current form, because the pressure is already in motion, the inflation, the fuel and bread shortages, the frozen cash, the military's expanding role in decisions that used to belong to civilians, all point towards something having to give eventually. The harder question is what replaces it, and on what timeline. That depends on whether the security forces that have stayed loyal through previous waves of unrest start to fracture this time, the way the resignation letter suggests parts of the civilian government already have. It depends on whether the succession question around an 86-year-old supreme leader gets resolved quietly from within the existing structure, or becomes the very crack that widens everything else. It depends on whether ongoing negotiations with the United States produce enough relief to buy the system more time, or whether they collapse the way the Doha talks over frozen cash nearly did. What we do know is this: a sitting president telling the Supreme Leader's office in writing that his own government has been pushed aside isn't a routine personnel matter, whatever state media decides to call it. It's a rare, on-the-record admission from inside the system that the story this regime has told about itself, a story of stability, control, and unshaken authority, no longer matches what's actually happening behind its own closed doors. Throughout history, the moment the people responsible for telling a story stop believing it themselves is usually the moment right before that story changes for good. The people standing in Iran's bread lines, the merchants who once helped end a monarchy, the families weighing medicine against meat, deserve to know that the world is watching this unfold in real time, even from the outside. In the end, currency exchange rates and inflation figures don't lie and they don't negotiate. The numbers behind what's happening in Iran have already told a good part of this story. What's left to find out is how much more has to break before the people who built this system are forced to face what their own arithmetic has been saying for years. If this video gave you a clearer picture of what's actually happening, make sure you're subscribed because this story is nowhere near finished.